All right. Did you follow all that? Okay, so let's just imagine that you're part of the ancient church, maybe, I don't know, 10, 20 years after this event takes place. Let's say maybe you're one part of the churches in sort of like Eastern Europe, Asia, the Turkey area, where John sort of has later some jurisdiction. Maybe one of those 7 churches that John would later write to from prison, right, with the book of Revelation. Ephesus, Smyrna, Philadelphia, Laodicea, maybe one of those churches, right? And you're there, and maybe it's on a Sunday morning, Lord's Day, and you're gathered and with the people maybe in a house church, and you're singing the songs, and then one of the leaders gets up, maybe reads one of the letters that's been circulating around the churches, and maybe gives some exposition on what it means to follow this Jesus with our lives. And he starts to talk about, in particular, this business of being faithful to Christ. And maybe he quotes John from the book of Revelation, who talks about how we overcome both by the blood of Christ, but then also by the word of our testimony to him, right? And so maybe the leader is urging you towards faithfulness and faithful witness. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, yeah, I should be faithful in my witness because of all that Jesus has done to me and all that he offers to people. But then you're like, yeah, but man, that is going to be costly, right? Because the Roman Empire is not too thrilled with this new upstart Christian religion and its people who will no longer attend, the national festivals for a lot of the Roman gods, or who won't come out and burn incense and give offering and worship the emperor. Right, so you're already sort of on thin ice with the Roman Empire, and it's starting to get a little bit dicey. Word is getting out around town about these Christians starting to lose relationships, right? So you're imagining that this is going to be costly for me. I'm going to lose some things in life if I do this boldly. I might lose relationships. I might lose, the financial well-being of my family, because I'm hearing that for some Christians it's hard to find jobs. Maybe I'll lose some of my freedom. I'll wind up in prison like John. Or maybe even I'll lose my life like I've heard about some of these Christians around the world. And let's just say for fun, hypothetically, that you turn to the guy next to you. Maybe you're a little new there, so you don't know everybody, and you see this guy, older guy that you don't know, and you just say, man, yeah. So what do you think about this? How do you handle this? How do you deal with this tension of wanting to be bold for your faith, but feel the pressure? And by the way, my name's so-and-so, nice to meet you. And he said, oh, nice to meet you. For fun. My name's Lazarus. All right, moved here to Ephesus, after from Bethany quite a few years ago for this reason or another. And yeah, I hear what you're saying. And yeah, it's kind of scary business, and there's a genuine risk out there, and there's loss, and that's hard, and that's difficult. But then imagine how Lazarus would answer that question. Like, I imagine he would say, yeah, I hear you, and that is hard, and I think about that often, but here's the thing. I've known this Jesus guy for quite some time, and what I've come to know, I won't go into it, I'll explain it some other time, but what I've come to know and what I have this rock-solid confidence in is that this Jesus has a very peculiar relationship with death. Or even more, that this Jesus has a very peculiar power over death, such that I don't know the answer to all your questions and what all is going on, but here's what I know. The safest place in the world is to be with him and wherever he leads. That's what I imagine he might say. So anyway, we'll come back to that maybe, but we're here and we're sort of coming to a break in the book of John. Chapters 11 and 12 kind of close up what most people refer to as like the first half, the book of signs in John, where John, gives, pretty much at this point, it's been a lot of John laying out 7 sort of miraculous signs that Jesus does, and using those signs as the means to then learn something about who Jesus is, right? And this is the 7th sign. It's the most dynamic, the most, whatever you want to call it, just strange sign of it, right? And so we're certainly going to talk about that, but if you've noticed in the text, like the actual sign itself of calling Lazarus out of that tomb, it's pretty quick and we don't get a whole lot about it. It's much more about these conversations that are taking place where the sign is almost just backing up this theological truth that's coming through about this Jesus in relation to death. And so that's how we're just going to kind of work through this and think about this. And I'm always just reminded that, as almost as we say each week through John, like John is writing these things, and he tells us at the end, Jesus did many more signs. Were I to record them all, right? All the books in the world couldn't hold them all. But these were written so that you may believe, and that he is the one Son of the Father, that he is the Son of God, and by believing have genuine life in his name. Right? And so we're asking that question, okay, what is everything that we're learning about Jesus? Yeah, what does that mean for me and for my life as I walk through this death-shadowed world? Okay? All right, so again, 4 sets of conversations. First, conversation Jesus has with his disciples, then with Martha, then with Mary and the crowd, and then we'll get into the addendum with some of the religious leaders. Okay, so first off, Jesus, remember where we left him off last week. He's on the other side of the Jordan now. He's left Jerusalem because it's gotten to the point in Jerusalem that when any of the religious leaders see him, and even some of the Jewish folks there, whatever, you know, they're trying to arrest him or they're picking up stones to kill him. And so Jesus is getting out of town. Not because he's fearful of that, but because, as he says over and over, my hour hasn't come. His time had not yet come. And so he's on the other side of the Jordan, probably a day's journey. And while he's over there teaching, baptizing, word comes to him that his good friend Lazarus has fallen deathly ill. Right? Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, dearly loved family for Jesus, right? And so he hears word, someone has come, let him know that Lazarus is deathly ill. And that starts up this conversation with his disciples. And I'll just highlight 2 things from this conversation. First of all, this sort of ambiguity about the business of death. Did you pick that up? Like first of all, he immediately says to his disciples, this illness will not lead to death, but it is so that the glory of God may be revealed. And then later, he will talk about Lazarus as having fallen asleep. And the disciples say, well, if he's fallen asleep, he's going to wake up. And Jesus clarifies, oh, no, sorry, let me clarify. He's dead. And he said, well, wait a second, I thought you just said this wasn't going to lead to death. And now you're saying he's dead. And then he goes on to say, and I'm glad I wasn't there for your sakes, that you may believe. Like, what are we talking about here? Part of that could be, you know, Jesus is saying, okay, the whole point of this, or here isn't where this story ends, and just this death of this man, but there's something beyond this. God is going to reveal his glory. I also think that this is sort of just one window into the way the Bible talks about death, which is just slightly different than the way we talk about and think about death. We tend to think about death simply as the body, you know, succumbing to illness or old age and shutting down and not working. But in the Bible, death is more than that. Death is about separation. It's about relationship, right? Death is this separation in the relationship that we were meant to enjoy with God's good creation, including our bodies. It is that. But beyond that, death is separation in our relationship with our life giver and the one who daily sustains our life. To be separated from our Creator is to begin to experience death. Death is separation even in relationship with the other people that God has created, right? It's all these relationships, and death is multifaceted in the Scripture, such that we could say, as we sang, right? You can be breathing, but not fully alive. Right? You can be walking about, the body's still functioning, and yet you're almost like a walking zombie, where like you're walking in sort of a deathly existence. And vice versa. The body may shut down, but yet that doesn't necessarily mean that I am to be separated from my Creator and life giver and be separated from life itself. Okay, so there's this ambiguity here about death, which he'll continue to unpack, but keep that in mind. The other aspect of the conversation here is that the disciples are pretty nervous about going back to Bethany. where Lazarus' family is and presumably where Lazarus is buried. Bethany would have been just on the other side of the Mount of Olives, which is just outside the gates of the old city of Jerusalem, right? The place where everybody's looking for Jesus and looking to arrest him or stone him or whatever. So these disciples are not too thrilled to go back to Bethany, which is really close. And it's there where Jesus, he throws out this interesting line. He says, "Are not there 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he doesn't stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." Oh, okay, I see. That makes it much clearer. Thank you. I'm not going to dive too deeply into try to explain all that, nor presume to know for certain what that means. But here's what I think it means. You say there's 12 hours in a day. Anybody in an agrarian society where you work the land, you know, okay, I've got 12 hours to get my work done today because I got 12 hours of daylight. All right, so I think he's saying, look, there's work to be done yet before my time comes. There's work to be done. We've only got 12 hours left. We have things we have to do. And then he also says, that those who walk in the day, are safe because they see the light of the world. And maybe just here I'll ask the simple question. Throughout the entire book of John, what is the light of the world? From chapter 1. Right? Yeah, Jesus himself. In him was life, says John in chapter 1. And that life was the light of man. Right? So I think Jesus is saying here, there's work to be done. And look, I know you're fearful, but the safest place is to always be with the light. It's to be in the light. In other words, your safest place is to be with me. Come with me. You can debate that, whatever. Talk about it sometime. Anyway, so there you go. So there's the conversation. So they start to head back to Bethany. Told Lazarus is 4 days in the tomb now. This probably gives you some indication that, Jesus waited 2 days, but it wasn't because, I don't know, that he wanted to wait until the sickness, fully grabbed hold of Lazarus. And he's probably been dead. If you do the math, 1 day to travel, the news to Jesus, 2 days there, Jesus finishes up what he's doing there, and then 1 day to travel back, 4 days. It's probably the case that Lazarus died a few hours after the messengers left to go get Jesus. Anyway, do with that what you want. But they come back to Bethany. Martha comes running out. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." Which I don't think, again, that's part of why I said that. I don't think this is Martha saying, "What took you so long?" Because I think Lazarus was already dead. I think the issue is Martha is saying here, Martha is giving out that cry that any faithful follower of Jesus feels in moments of crisis, in moments of trial, where that sting of death is just kind of looming. It's like, I need to be near to Jesus. Lord, where are you? I think Martha's crying out, "Lord, had you been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And yet I know, whatever you ask in God's name, he'll do. And Jesus says, "Do you believe your brother's going to live?" And Martha, like a good Jewish person who would have known her prophets, who would have known like Isaiah 25, that looks forward to a day, we read this a couple weeks ago, where God is going to wipe away every tear from every eye, and one day he will swallow up the shadow that covers the earth. He will swallow up death forever, right? So anybody steeped in the prophets would have said, yeah, of course, I know my brother will live one day. There's a resurrection coming at the end, and I look forward to that. And Jesus pushes it, and he says, okay, I am. Another thing Jesus says a lot throughout the book of John, I am, and then he explains that. So here's the last time in connection to one of these signs. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live, and whoever lives, if he believes in me, will never die. Okay, a little bit more ambiguity there about this business of death. But the part that I want to highlight is notice how Jesus doesn't say, I am the one who gives resurrection, and I am the one who gives life. He could have said that, but he doesn't. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Implication being, resurrection and life, and I think this is what Jesus is getting at here, is not something just that is given to you as a gift, but it is something that we experience through association with Jesus himself, or in relationship with him, or as Jesus will go on in chapters 13, 14, and 15, right? Resurrection and life to the full is stuff that we experience as we abide in Jesus, or as we've already talked about, as we are united to Jesus by his Spirit. And again, this is stuff that Jesus is going to unpack in chapters 13, 14, and 15. But he will, in those sections, you'll see that life itself is not the ultimate promise and the ultimate gift. What is the ultimate gift is the pouring out of his Spirit, where Jesus is saying, look, entrust your life to me, believe in me, and I will come to dwell in you. My Father, he will literally say, my Father and I will make our home with you, in you, by the Spirit. This Spirit who is life, right? So to be joined to Jesus, to be united in rich relationship with him, is to have his Spirit within you, which itself is life. Or as Paul will put it, and here's where those of you sitting next to Mike Plort have to hold him down, because every time we talk about this, he wants to jump up and say, my mind is blown. Like Paul will talk about the Spirit as being the what? The down deposit of that future final resurrection life in the here and now. Right? And when you think about what a deposit means, that means, well, usually, okay, here's the deposit. You get the full payment later, right? So there's this guarantee with the Spirit that we have been people who are marked one day for resurrection life to the full. But that's not it. Right? To have association with Jesus, to believe in him, to entrust your life to him, to receive the wonderful gift of his Spirit, is even here and now to experience the first fruits, the initial installment of that life to come. Which is to say that I think this sign that Jesus is about to do is really just to back up this bigger truth that has been throughout the whole book, and Jesus is now saying to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me ultimately will never die. Ultimately, this side of death, you experience life in its richness. Immediately after death, you are still yet joined to me, and somehow in the presence of the Father, finding rest like we see throughout the book of Revelation, and interceding before the throne. And then one day, it's resurrection life in its fullest sense. Okay? You with me? All right, there's the second conversation. Third conversation. Martha goes back to the home, goes to get Mary. Mary, Jesus is here. He's calling for you. And so Mary gets up, out of her weeping, and she leaves to go to Jesus. And, this is what they did back then. You had a 7-day mourning and grief period, and all your friends and family and neighbors would come to be with you, to encourage you, comfort you during that week of grief. Right? So Mary's going out, and, her Jewish brothers and sisters are coming with her, following her to Jesus where he is. And again, she falls on her face and says, Lord, had you been here? Oh, man, this is just a side tangent. But you go back and you think about people in the early church. I think the two existential questions are, this wrestling with the problem of death and the absence of Jesus. Right? Where is Jesus in our time of trial? Why isn't he back yet? And I just think you see that theme, even you see it all throughout the book, but then you see it in this chapter. Like, Jesus, if you had only been here. Anyway, Jesus looks at her in her grief, in her sadness. She's falling on the floor in front of him. He looks at, the friends and the family who are there, joined in the grief and their sadness and all of it. And the text says he was deeply moved and greatly troubled. And we read that line, deeply moved, greatly troubled, leading ultimately to John 11:35, and Jesus wept. And we tend to think of that as, okay, yeah, look, there's the human Jesus who sees and who has compassion and who feels the sadness, and he's moved by it such that he is moved to tears. And yes, it is that, but it's a whole lot more. Give me bear with me here. The Greek word, oh man, I'm going to forget it. Ebrameomai, I think is the word behind that word, deeply troubled. And it's a word that would often be used to refer to like the snort of a horse in war, right? So imagine horses carrying their soldiers out into conflict, out in the Roman Empire or whatever, and the horse, right, as it's rushing out into the battlefield. And when it's used to refer to humans and to men and women, like it's a word that describes like this fury, or like this anger, or like this outrage. And that word, deeply troubled, like that's the word tarasso, and that has this idea of something being greatly stirred. Like that word would often be used to describe a raging sea, where the waves are anything but calm and quiet, but they're choppy and they're tossing ships to and fro, right? That sea is tarasso, it's greatly moved, right? So the picture here is literally, as Jesus is taking this in, as he is seeing the sorrow and the sadness on Mary, as he's seeing what it's causing to the friends and the family and those who are gathered, there is this fury. There is this rage, there is this anger that is boiling up inside of Jesus such that you can almost imagine him visibly agitated and stirred. I tell people all the time, and you hear it from me, anytime I do a funeral, I say, I don't know if I'm, you get what you get with me giving funeral messages. I don't know if I'm the best one to deliver funeral messages because I don't tend to rosy up this business of death. Usually when I'm sitting in a funeral, what I'm feeling is certainly sadness for the family, sadness for the loss, but then there's just this underlying, this anger that is, in the face. Like everything that we're doing here is not right. And I talk about it all the time. Like I think sometimes in our own culture, like we rosy up death too much and we make it just, I don't know, we bring in the professionals that come and they put all the nice flowers on and they have this, these coffins now are basically these elaborate jewelry boxes type of things, that are there, and then we go to the graveyard and we put more flowers on it and then we all leave before all the dirty work is done, in come the professionals to take care, put it down. And I don't know. There should be, in my mind, just more of this inner revulsion towards the issue of death. And I take that from Scripture, from 1 Corinthians 15, where death is named the last great enemy of God to be destroyed. Or a passage like this, where Jesus, as he surveys the scene and he sees the wreckage and he sees the havoc and the destruction that death is leaving in its wake, he is roused to anger. Like a general who's about to go into war and who longs to fight this battle with this great enemy that he's been waiting for. Sometimes, I feel like I'm ranting again. It's been a couple weeks of ranting here, but bear with me. Sometimes I would just say, be careful in the way we talk about death. Sometimes I hear people talk about death as almost as like, yeah, Jesus is okay with that. Oh yeah, God needed another angel in heaven, and so he called home our dear brother and sister to glory. And yes, there's truth in all that, and I understand the sovereignty of God, and and we affirm that, and there certainly is glory there, but let's not gloss over that in this moment, when Jesus stares in the face of death's havoc and its wreckage in the people that he loves, he is ticked, and he is ready to go to war. And that's what he does. Take me to that grave. Just, by the way, back then, not in the ground. We're mostly like in a cave. Dig out a hole and put the body in there. They wrap it up with spices, with wraps and spices and things. And we're told again, this has been 4 days, right? 4 days was believed, that's the start of decomposition. People back then, they believed day 1, 2, and 3, there was this sort of superstition that maybe spirits could come back into the body, but by the time you reach day 4, no, he's dead. and they're starting some decomposition. So Jesus says, you roll that stone away. Mary says, decomposition, it's not, that ain't going to be pretty. Roll that stone away. Did I not tell you, you're about to see the glory of God here? And then he comes up in front of that, and you just imagine this scene. Mary's there, falling apart. The crowd is walking up behind them, and they're there, and then in a loud voice, in a loud voice, he cries out, the text says, Lazarus, come out. This isn't just some, Star Wars Jedi, very quiet, meditative, putting his hand out, starting to shake. No, this is a war cry. Do you see the picture here? This is the conquering king coming face to face with his enemy, and in this loud, primal war cry, Lazarus, get out, right? You see it? And he comes out. He says, unbind him, take the wraps off, unwrap the head, the whole thing, and they do that. All right, where are we at? Last conversation. So then notice what happens. Some of the people, some of the Jews who were gathered there, they believe immediately, this is the Son of God. And then the others, there's like this division. There's always this division after these signs. And then the others, they go run off to the Pharisees. I don't know why. Maybe some of them, I don't know, just couldn't possibly wrap their mind around this and said, oh, no, there's some hoax going on here. We got to go tell the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and whoever. Or maybe they did sort of believe and say, I don't know what's going on here, but all I know is this isn't going to be good. Because now everybody's going to start following this guy, and there's going to be this tension and this division, and it's going to get ugly, and so they go running off to tell the Pharisees. And sure enough, that's where you get this conversation. Caiaphas, the high priest, gathers the council and says, all right, guys, look, enough of this. This guy has got to go. This man has got to die so that the city, the state, the nation, the people would be saved. And a typical part of the irony that John often will bring out here. Like on the one hand, yeah, there's some truth there because Caiaphas, he's all worried about Rome. He's seen what happens when you have these little Messiah figures that grab, a bunch of rebels and people around them, and then they, cause a bit of problems and create strife and division, and then maybe it turns into violence until eventually Rome comes in and says, yeah, enough with this, and they squash the rebellion, they level the city or whatever, and Caiaphas, he's trying to keep peace, he's trying to preserve. So there's part of that, right? But then John also goes on to say, yeah, but he really didn't understand what he was saying. That, yeah, this Jesus is going to die for the nation, for the people. He's going to die for his Jewish brothers and sisters who belong to him, and not just for them, but for all the people who are scattered abroad, so that through his death he might bring them together as the one children of God, the one family of Christ. In other words, this final conversation clues us in that this whole sign, this whole incident with Lazarus was really just prelude for where we're going next. That this really was just the prelude interaction with death to this much more climactic interaction with death that's about to take place, where Jesus, in more climactic fashion, is going to go to war with his greatest enemy. And he's going to do it in the most subversive and strange way, right? He's going to come by offering himself unto death, coming and getting in front of his people, in the way in between his people and death, and offering himself as the sacrifice. And he's going to suffer the full weight of death. Death is going to exhaust itself on him. He's going to suffer the full curse of death, such that it's literally going to sap his life away, and he's going to be plunged into the grave. He is going to suffer the stranglehold, the grip that death holds over sinners, as it is the just penalty for sin and rebellion against the Creator. Jesus is going to suffer that into this full. And when death has exhausted itself, done its worst, unleashed everything it possibly could on Jesus, then Jesus, in the most climactic victory the world's ever known, will come walking out of his own tomb, victorious over the power of death. And he's going to do that so that he might lead his people. Or so that he might secure for his people that resurrection life to the full, so that then he can pour out his Spirit and be life to them and victory now, so that he can gather them up when death does its worst and usher them into his presence, and so that one day he may give them the full payment of resurrection life to the full. So there it is, right? This is a wonderful story. And in this, in this 4 conversations, we get a pretty clear picture of Jesus' relation to death. And I think this is so that, in John's mind, I'm telling you this, I'm relaying this, I'm giving you these conversations so that you can know who this Jesus is, and so that you can have the utmost of confidence in him and trust your life to him and to follow him wherever he goes, right? He's holding this Jesus out before you so that you can be confident that Jesus is one who is deeply moved in your own times of grief and loss, sorrow and pain. It's not just there thinking, geez, come on, don't these people know the promises that I have for them? Why are they so sad? Let's get up and just get out. No, he's agitated. He's moved by the wreckage that comes. John wants you to have the utmost confidence in this Jesus, such that whatever comes in life, whatever Jesus calls you into, whatever waits you there, whether it's just wonderful joys, or whether it's hardship, whether it's trial, whether it's sacrifice, John wants you to see that the safest place in the world for you would be to be near to the one who has conquered the power of death. Right? John wants you to see and to have the utmost confidence in this idea that this Jesus has conquered death for you and for your sake, right? And that he is pouring out his Spirit on you, the Spirit that we read from Romans 8, the one who raised Jesus to life. Will he not also give life to our mortal bodies and raise us up with him? John wants you to have confidence that this victorious King will not let anything pull you out of his plan for you and in the promises to lead you into that resurrection life. Nothing, says the end of Romans 8, should ever separate us from the love of God. Right? And John wants you to have confidence that as you pursue Jesus now, as you make those daily decisions to press towards him, to call out to him, to listen carefully to his voice, to yearn for his Spirit, that even now, no matter what, Jesus can lead you into life, rich, meaningful life that is full of joy, full of power, an experience of life that death or enemies or rulers or authority, they can't rob you of. Circumstances can't take that from you because Jesus himself is the resurrection and the life. And just as we close, as we often do, just a word to any who might be here, wouldn't consider yourself a follower of Jesus. You read a story like this, and you're like, well, I don't even know what to make of that. I don't know I don't even know if I believe that story is true. I get that. There's a bunch of religious texts out there with miraculous claims that I don't buy, right? I don't get that. So I imagine you might have, if you're new to this, you might have some of that skepticism. And I don't know what I think about this story. And all I would say to you, there's a ton we could say to that, but what I would say to you is this: notice what happens on the back end of this, which happens all throughout the book of John. When there are these incredible signs, it's not that all of a sudden everybody, yeah, clearly he is who he says he is, let's get on board with this. No, it creates a division. Right? Or it reveals, that there's a real division here. Or it highlights that this idea that throughout the book of John, that it's not as if you just see something miraculous, that's all I need, and then I'll believe. No, that's not how it happens in John. And what John is clear to say is that you always need both. You need the deed, but you also need the word of God that reveals himself to you. Right? You need to be like sheep who come to learn the voice of the shepherd. Right? You need to be people who, like Mary and Martha, who say, I don't know, but I just need to be near Jesus. Jesus, where are you? Where were you? Why weren't you here? In other words, maybe the challenge I would leave you with is that the invitation this morning is not to go home and to rationally try to think, okay, was this true? Was it not true? What does that mean? Or whatever. There's a time and a place for that. But I would say it's even more if you hear this and struggle and you wrestle with that, just consider this notion that throughout the book of John, like death does this other thing where it makes it hard for us to see and it makes us hard for us to hear and it makes us hard for us to believe and to follow. And so if you sense this pull this morning that there may be something to this Jesus, maybe your first step is you need to cry out to him. I don't necessarily have a relationship with you. I don't know you, but Jesus, have mercy on me. Help me in my unbelief. And maybe your first step is, or your next step is just to spend time in his word, just to try to listen for that voice and see if Jesus won't meet you in that word and start to speak to you and to your own heart. Or maybe it's to be more like Mary and Martha who just say, okay, I don't know, I don't have this all figured out, but I just need to move closer towards Jesus. And as you do that, you'll start to hear that voice and you'll start to feel that grace and that power of that Spirit. And you'll start to see, and you'll start to hear, and you'll start to believe and entrust. For all of us, though, right? It's going back to the very beginning. Whatever God calls us to, however he leads us out, man, I want to have what I imagine the confidence that Lazarus had throughout life, even on his own next deathbed. I know this Jesus. He has a peculiar relationship with death. He has peculiar power over death. He is the victorious king over death. And so wherever he leads me, however he calls me, whatever he does in my life, man, I can go at it with confidence because I am going at it clinging to this king of life. And I pray God would lead us all in that, all for his honor and glory and for whatever he wants to do in and through us here at Grace Church. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.